Okay, let's have a look now at another decisive game from the Tal Memorial tournament way back in round 1 a few days back. It was Vladimir Kramnik playing white against Nepomniachtchi. I hope that's close to how it's pronounced anyway. So Kramnik's 2800 FIDE, not bad FIDE rating, and Ian is 2730. So Ian playing black, Vladimir plays knight f3, the Reti, which can transpose like a chameleon into other systems like the English opening. In fact, it does so now. After black plays c5, it could also, of course, transpose into e4 opening Sicilian defence, but the English opening is chosen, so that's more in Vladimir's style, positional. Eyeing d5. So black plays knight c6 and white plays knight c3, so both sides eyeing the central squares. Black's got a dark square campaign usually and white a light square campaign. Now committal move e5, which as many of you know, I often play this system myself. It leaves a slight weakness on d5, which often proves to be a crumbling point of my position. So how does Ian play this position, the reverse kind of Botvinnik system? Well, both sides now prepare to fianchetto their bishops, and now Vladimir doesn't routinely castle, but instead plays the move a3. So positionally, a3 is trying to get maybe the temptation for black later to capture away from the centre, to lose the central grip, so white can create a sort of preponderance of pawns in the centre. Central pawn mobility is the name of the game. Once you have central pawn mobility, they can crash through and you can literally just crush the opponents, maybe in the middle game or the end game. So that's the basic idea. Also, of course, b4 is useful, as in the Sicilians, for the bishop fianchettoing, and that would challenge this bishop, which would in turn, if that's exchanged off, often weaken dark squares in black's camp. So, having said all that, black just plays d6. Now Vladimir castles, and now Ian plays knight Ge7, not fearing really b4. And you might wonder, should he be sort of preparing something against this b4? For example, you know, earlier, instead of knight Ge7, he could have maybe start to be prepared for this diagonal, etc., to be sort of playing a move like say bishop g4 to be able to play rook c8 and then maybe b6 later. But he's not really concerned about b4 from the evidence of this, and he's got a surprise idea, or seemingly surprising idea here, of seemingly going in with the hypermodern strategy that white is also trying to provoke black to have weak pawns in the centre sometimes, and this next move, which appears forcing, might actually be overly committal. It needs the case can be made either way, it would seem. Black now plays e4, so in one way it's forcing, and of course it's making use of the pin on the rook, but is this pawn actually going to be a liability, a long-term strategic liability? So short-term, yeah, it's a forcing move, but long-term, is it strategically suspect or not? Knight e1, and we know from these types of positions that often knight e1 is the prelude to a manoeuvre like this to really eye that d5 square. So the pawn is now supported with f5. We have now bishop b2. So there's an ominous sort of staring of the bishops, and if, as I say, if this bishop gets exchanged, often black is left with potentially losing weaknesses on the dark squares. But Ian just castles. Now we have an undermining move straight away on that e4 pawn. So is it suspect? Well, here actually black plays a counter-attacking move. It doesn't play e takes d, which might also be adequately answered with knight takes d3, with the idea of knight f4 maybe, and eyeing that d5 square again. I think e takes d3 would be more passive, because white would want to also have frontal pressure on the d file, so that would tick all the boxes. I think e takes d3, knight takes d3. Let's just make sure of that for players on the black side, to be aware of the dangers here. I think the best move was played, one of the best moves was played, which is bishop e6. If d takes, this is leaving white with advantage. Yeah, knight takes d3. I think there's potential for knight f4, but at the moment, okay, it's more complex than that because of c4 here. But anyway, let's go back onto the game. So d3, bishop e6. c4 is put into question. This is a delicate part of the chain, not to lose here perhaps, but Vladimir takes the decision to go for that e4 pawn, to let c4 drop. Now with that, we need to assess here, I think, central pawn mobility for both sides. If this pawn drops, then the grip on d5 is also being undermined, which means in turn this central pawn mobility of this pawn could be an issue later. So d takes e4, and now not bishop takes c4, but f takes e4. So both pawns are attacked. This one by 2 pieces, this one by 1 piece. Bishop takes e4, but assess the central pawn mobility here after bishop takes c4, and we see actually that black has a running d pawn potentially with tempo gain on this knight as well, and he makes use of that now after Vladimir's next move, knight c2, which might have a rerouting idea of knight e3 in mind. Black plays d5, and now with tempo d4. So the position is really transforming quite rapidly. Knight e4, and now, okay, if white is given time here, well, white's putting pressure on c5. b6 would weaken the diagonal, but also perhaps white is threatening to blockade this pesky d4 pawn with knight e1 to d3. Once he can do that, this would be quite annoying, trying to undermine it later. So there's these different possibilities of extending the scope of white's pieces, especially these bishops. You know, this natural target d4, maybe it can first be blockaded, but black sharpens up the position here. I wonder if you can spot black's next move here if I give you 10 seconds and try and wipe out some of these arrows. So 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, in plays bishop takes e2, sharpens up the position, forcing move, forcing move. So exchange of minor pieces, he's grabbed the dark square bishop in exchange for his light square bishop. So is black now weaker on the light squares? Well, at least he doesn't have to worry too much about his dark square king safety here, given that white's lost his dark square bishop. But there's some other issues in the position. This d pawn can be pinned, which it is, and now it's unpinned and forcefully getting off the queens. So if queen e6 check was a threat earlier, it's not now after queen c8. Was in fact queen e6 on the cards in this position, you might ask, if we just rewind here? If queen e6 check, was that actually playable? Was that one of the stronger moves? Engines like rook ab1 or rook a2, not actually rook ad1. Rook ad1, almost so giving black advantage. Queen e6 check, it's got a slight issue with it, maybe just king h8. It's a bit harmless because the bishop's covering that diagonal now adequately, and white doesn't have a dark square bishop, I guess. So rook ad1. The queen is now challenged, and it's difficult with this imminent threat to avoid the exchange of queens. So we're going rapidly into an endgame position after the exchange of queens, near endgame position. C takes b4, a takes b4. Strategically, black has now potential to create an outside pass pawn, 2-to-1 pawn majority. Okay, white has a 3-to-2 over here, but it seems that's more complex to exploit. Black's got a blockading square, f5 for example. It's going to be trickier, it seems, intuitively, for white to use the kingside pawn majority. But black also has seemingly more initiative here after rook cd8. He's dictating to white again what to do. Can white afford just to reinforce the rook here? Is that out of the question? Vladimir took rook takes d8. I wonder if rook d1 was possible, or is there something horrible waiting for white if rook d1? Apparently that's might be okay. Rook at fd1. Okay, so he did actually take on d8, which seemingly is a little bit surprising. It leaves the black rook active on the d file. Okay, but it seems white still technically had the advantage here in this position. He's got rook b1, forcing move of his own, with strategic motive maybe to try and advance this pawn, maybe put some pressure on the queen side. But here after bishop g7, Vladimir actually plays h4. Now b5 from white is ruled out by black's next move, which looks a little bit committal to put that pawn there. It's a potential target, and in fact it is targeted immediately with bishop f1. It's supported, but now is a6 the target? That's the next question. Knight c5. Knight c5 comes at a cost though. The weakness of that last move, knight c5, is the rook is now invited to come to d2 with tempo, and the invitation is taken up, rook d2. So after that though, is a6 in trouble? Is this a big problem here? The a6 pawn. Black's next move looks to be fairly tactically oriented. Bishop d4, offering a6. So what would happen here if knight takes a6? I wonder. Is it possibly a case of bishop takes e3 and knight e5? Let's check this. In the game, Vladimir played knight e4, so there's something horrible perhaps lurking here on knight takes a6, and it could be very, very simple. Knight takes a6. Apparently bishop takes e3, yes. Now knight e5. So knight f3 is threatening actually a mate in 2. So that has to be stopped somehow. Bishop takes b5 for example. Apparently this is leading to equality, or slightly better for black. These squares, these knights are looking pretty menacing. So in this position, this is very dynamic. Black is 2 pawns down, but faced with clear threats to his king's safety. Check, say, knight f5. So only a pawn down. Black has a lot of pressure on white's king side, and could probably, okay, if he regains all the pawns, there's only this passed pawn. Black stands better here, technically. Okay, so this is a cause for concern, this rupturing of king safety. So interesting pawn sack here, idea with bishop d4. So maybe this was seen well in advance, because that b5 was a committal move. If it has to be supported with a6, so see this bishop d4 and this idea of fracturing the structure here. If knight d1, I could imagine knight takes b4 being dangerous because of this loose knight on c5 as well. So knight e4, I suppose, immediately asks the rook to move. The rook does move, going into a more simplified endgame position now. But again, black stands with a 2-to-1 pawn majority on the queen side here, and an immediate threat in this position of the b4 pawn. So that's protected. And now it's attacked again, knight d5. So is Vladimir in real trouble here? Or can he not just counter-attack? He counter-attacks with knight c5. But capturing on b4 does protect a6. So black now all of a sudden, for the first time in the game, is a pawn up. However, it's opposite coloured bishop time after knight d3. Surely Vladimir, with opposite coloured bishops, has some hope of a draw. But it is a 2-to-0 pawn majority. It's two connected passed pawns here in this position. So this looks as though it might be quite tricky to draw this. The king now comes in, gliding across f4, king e6, carries on its travel, carries on, and it's going into a menacing position now, herding the pawns. Vladimir's trying to swap off these pawns now on the king side. a4. So now, if Vladimir did go in for the bishop to take that pawn, I think a3 or maybe b4 b3 is going to be winning here. Let's check this out. Vladimir played bishop c2. Let's just do a check of that question. Could white have afforded to take on g6? Okay, black maybe doesn't play hg, but maybe h6 is considered as well. Or even stronger, b4. Wow, b4, absolutely decisive move here, because there is a dark square blockade. So b4. Whoa. So once b3 happens, say takes, I think, is it b3? And white's looking to be defenseless against a3, a2. This bishop is cutting off the king. The king's really cut off these two squares. These three squares are all cut off. How does white defend that? It looks as though it's absolutely decisive. Just this idea of sacking the pawn. Fg, if hg out of interest, I don't think that is as good then. So say bishop takes g6 might actually be playable. Bishop e8, forcing the pawns on light squares. Bishop f7. So that was absolutely critical to sack a pawn here. Ingenious move, a4, then in light of that. So black technically having an advantage now according to calculations here. So bishop c2. Now a3, and of course there's no time to win a pawn anymore because of a2s. So bishop b1. There's an immediate threat of a2 as well, which needs to be parried. So actually Vladimir is losing yet another pawn now after g takes f5. So it's 3 pawns up. Sorry, it was a 2-to-0 pawn majority here. It's 2 pawns up for black now. King c2, king b4. Can a light square blockade be kept? Bishop e5. Unfortunately, these pawns are on dark squares, so they're sort of munchable soon. In fact, after a2, there's an exchange of prisoners, as Nxd3 would say. 2 weaknesses exchanged off. h5, h6. So we've got 2 outside passed pawns, which we know is dangerous from the previous game on YouTube on this channel. 2 passed pawns on both sides of the board are difficult to handle, much more difficult than 1 outside passed pawn. So bishop d5, b4. This is really stretching white's resources if both pawns represent major threats. So the bishop's kind of overloaded. Bishop f6. King goes to b1 here. b3, and actually Vladimir decides that he's had enough here. Let's see, he resigned here, but let's see some concrete examples of black winning this, if possible. So say king c1. Does b2 check do the job? So say king c2, and now f3 is a key move, it would seem, yes, because bishop takes f3 decoys the bishop away from a2, so the king can jump into a2 to support b1. So that's over. So there's this overloading of the two outside pass pawns in this situation, which is decisive. Wow. For me, unfortunately for me, this for the reverse Botvinnik system fans, it seems to be very sharp and tactical and based on an early b4 from white, which as a reference stem game for this particular acceleration of b4 is useful, but in the general case, white is often playing more quietly. It would have been interesting to see a more quiet plan rather than this accelerated b4 plan, which leads to very sharp consequences in this particular game very soon. It will be interesting to see other reverse Botvinnik systems with a quieter knight maneuver plan, to see how they're successful sometimes for black. But yeah, this is the case of this game, that we have here a sharp early confrontation after b4. There's an underlying tension of who's going to get greater, central pawn mobility, or are these pawns going to be weak? Is the hypermodern effect of blowing up the pawn center going to take effect? Because it's almost like a reverse King's Indian strategy from white. Is this overly provocative? But it seems black is able to hold the balance. Bishop e6, striking at c4. So white takes on e4, takes, and now c4 drops. So a central pawn mobility implication is revealed here, and that's made use of. But it requires possibly some nerve to do this against Vladimir Kramnik. But bishop takes e2, and it seems we reach a position where one of black's potential downfalls is removed. The potential fatal weakening of dark squares around his king is not an issue in this particular game, but he has to deal with the possibility that his queenside pawns, although a 2-to-1 pawn majority, might be a liability. But it seems he proved in this game that they weren't a liability, and in fact black's bishop is actually a bit of a hero here in conjunction with this rook. Potential has come to the 7th rank. So if this a6 is going to be a weakness, these two guys are going to say something about it, and they do. That a6 has committed to, and now both of these guys come in for that potential f2 weakness, or this fracturing of white's kingside. So bishop d4, critical moment, and this causes Vladimir to retreat his plan, go in reverse gear with knight e4. So we're back to that more clearer picture that black has the 2-to-1 pawn majority, and again the question is put without such a risk that they're actually weak, these pawns here in this position, because actually it's b4 that's immediately under fire now. Again under fire, and it's Vladimir fighting for the draw now in the opposite colour bishop and pawn ending. But this seems to be expertly played now by Ian, with a very, very timely and instructive pawn sacrifice at a critical moment. So just here playing a genius move A4, which gains critical time, not bothering to take on F5. So if FG, he just carries on ploughing in with B4 to really make use of his two connected passed pawns for B3 and A3 to be decisive. That's absolute genius. It shows that opposite coloured bishop and pawn endings are actually quite tricky, potentially, to draw. A lot of people assume it might be quite easy to draw most of them, but black only a pawn up is able to extract a win here. In this position, we can just quickly ask here, was bishop c2 optimal? What did an engine think? I actually thought black's got a small advantage. Big advantage. It's led white to a critical position, this A4 idea. Strange. So bishop c2, A3, and now the creation of passed pawns on both sides of the board is really stretching white's resources here, especially with that king coming right down to A3. So this leads to a decisive game in round one. Vladimir, he had enough roundabout here. After B3, I think resign occurred. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.